Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Again, this is the Saturday Python tutoring session. For those of you who haven't been here before, welcome. And the way this works is if I get questions ahead of time, I may prepare a script, that kind of stuff. So I had one question so far. So I'm going to go through that particular solution based on that question. So the way to do that is send me an email message the day before or post to the discussion thread, and myself or Elizabeth will pick those up and make sure that we address those during the tutoring session. In addition, once I go through the example that I have prepared for this morning, I'll open it up for questions, and you can do one of two things, whatever you're more comfortable with. You can post questions to the chat, and or you can open your mic. I'll mute all the mics only because there's quite a few folks here. But the mics are available. You just have to unmute your mic if you want to speak. Speaking of that, just to make sure that we're all live here, can somebody just send me a chat message to let me know that you can hear me and see my screen okay? Anybody? Great, thank you, perfect. Okay, so the question that I got was ahead of time was exiting loops, and there's a couple of really simple things, but then there's a slightly more complicated way to do that. This is a really simple script that I put together to kind of demonstrate the different ways that we exit loops. One of the really cool things about Python is the ability for Python to iterate through different objects that are created within Python. As you probably know, all variables within Python are objects which have properties and methods associated with them. And for most of them, the ability to iterate over that particular object, whether it happen to be a string, a list, a set, a dictionary, for example, all the built-in types, and in some cases, other more advanced types, we can iterate over them. So in this case, I'm just going to open I'm going to use the OS library, and I'm going to use one of the methods within the OS library to bring in a list of entries that are in a particular directory on my system. And so when I do that, if I put my cursor over dir list, and it basically is going to show me all of the entries that were in that particular directory. And you notice the square brackets at the beginning and the end indicate that this is in fact the list, but also because I named it. In other words, I could have called this anything. I could have called it foo, bar, Joe, whatever. But I decided to call it dir list. And that kind of reminds me that, hey, this is a list that's coming back from OS Lister. So by using camel case, like I'm doing here, you can help identify those types of variables just to remind yourself what they are. So in this particular case, I'm going to iterate over the dir list and, over the dir list in order to print out what each entry is. So if I step through a couple of these, you can kind of see in the bottom of the screen, those entries for each of the lists are coming in. But I don't have to tell Python when to end this loop. And the reason is that since Python knows the length of the list, it'll go through each of the items in the list. And once it exhausts those, it will exit. So if I go through and I'm stepping through each line here, and once I get to the end of the list, I don't have to do anything, and Python automatically exits the list. This is not exactly the question that was asked, but I just wanted to make sure that is there. You can also do this with a range. Let's say, for instance, you wanted to go through a loop for a certain number of values. You can use the range function. That's a built-in Python function that allows you to generate a range. I basically said my range is from 1 to 10. And if I again go through this, I can say for value, whatever the value is in the range. So every time we go through this loop, in this case, Python is going to execute the function range, that built-in function. And every time through the loop, it's going to give me the next value in the range. So in this case, it starts with 1 and it goes through 9. And you're saying, why did it go through 9 when I said range is 1 to 10? In Python, the last value, whether you're slicing a variable or something, is always the stop value, and that's not included in what you're doing. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're actually doing specific counts. Here's one that's just a little bit more complicated and more, I think, addressing the question that came up that I received via email was, what if I'm actually going to process a particular file and I'm going to read chunks from that particular file? So instead of reading the entire file into a variable, I'm going to read a chunk of the file each time through the loop. And so the first thing we have to do is open the file. And I can put my cursor over target. That's my target file. And it indicates, yep, that's the file that I have. And you notice that this is a JPEG. So I opened it as RB, read binary. So I can only read from this file. That's the first parameter R, but I want to read it as a binary file because it's not just simply text. JPEG files are binary. I'm going to set my chunk count to 1 as we start. And now I'm going to do something called while true. So I'm going to execute this loop forever until I get a break. And so what this is going to do, and why this one's just a bit more complicated, is I'm going to say while true, and I'm going to say, hey, read a chunk. And I said, read a chunk of 1K, 10,024 bytes. And if there is data in the chunk, I put my cursor over a chunk, and sure enough, I've got a bunch of data in the chunk. So if the chunk has data, we're going to enter the indentation under the if. And you might say, well, why does that work? It works because if the chunk is empty, in other words, if I read the value from the target file and there was nothing returned and I didn't get any values, that chunk value, because it's empty, will be false. If I actually say if chunk, it's going to say, well, that's false because I don't have any chunks. So in this case, I do have a chunk. So it's going to print out the chunk count. And every time through the loop, it's going to print the chunk count. It's going to do that until there is no chunk. So let me set a breakpoint here so we can kind of see what happens when we get the break. So if chunk returns is value is false, then we're going to exit from this. So I'm just going to hit F5 within this, basically start go instead of hitting F6 like I've been doing to step over the statements. And we got there. If I put my cursor over chunk, you notice that it's empty. And that's why when we evaluated if chunk, it hit the break. And now that it hit the break, we're going to do a couple things. We hit F6 again to step over the break. And when I do, it's going to take the next statement outside of the while. It's no longer indented under the while. It's outside of the while, right? So I'm going to print out that statement that says exit while true. There's no more chunks, okay? And now it's going to come back and say, okay, I'm going to process this with clause, but we have nothing else to do. It's done. So now it's going to basically say, hey, file closed as we exited this section. So the with option in this example says, hey, I want to do this chunk of code with that file open. Once I'm done, once I exit that, hey, the with option is going to automatically close that file for me. So I don't have to worry about cleanup. It actually does it for me. So that's kind of the advantage of using with within this particular case. So everything under the indented under the with gets executed. And once that exits, it automatically closes the file for me. So that was the only question that I got this week to kind of go over, but it points out several really important elements. Number one, all Python variables are objects. We can iterate over them, especially if they're a string, a list, a set, a dictionary, etc. All give me that ability. But when I'm dealing with something like a binary file and I want to read chunks at a time, then I have to actually set up a little more complex scenario where I'm going to read the chunks until I've exhausted all of the chunks. In this case, when I do that, I print out that variable. So that's the example that the question that I received. Hopefully that answers the question that came up. And what I want to do now is answer any other questions that you guys might have. We can try to do those live. And again, thanks for everybody showing up this morning. It's always better. I do record these, and let me double check that I started the recording. I hope I did. Yes, I did. Okay, so these will all be recorded and I post them back to each of the sections. So you'll be able to see this this tutoring session if that was helpful. Any questions from the group that we want to try to handle live? Like I said, I can do the best I can. If I don't have to write a significant script here, I can probably knock some of the questions off. And again,
I have a question.
Shane, Nicholas, sure.
So yesterday I finished the assignment 7 where we had to extract the email list and URL list from the memory dump.
Yeah.
And so I got that done and it lists everything that I need. However, obviously there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of duplicates. So I wanted to put all that stuff into a pretty table and just have a count of the duplicates. So, there wasn't a super long list of duplicate emails and URLs.
Mhm.
However, I couldn't, for some reason, figure out how to get that count to work. And I kept just getting a 1 on every single um, entry. And so I was wondering if you could clarify on how to get the count to work because I couldn't seem to figure that out.
Sure. So typically the way we do this, let me ask you a question back. Are you using a dictionary to keep track of the, for example, the URLs or the for each one that you found? Is that how you're actually tallying the count?
Yeah, so all of the emails are going into a dictionary called email list, and then the URLs are going into a dictionary called URL list.
Okay, so let's actually do something really simple here. I'm not obviously going to do that assignment, but what I can
Yeah.
do is I can say, I'm just going to say L just to keep it simple. I'm going to say L is a list, and we'll say ABC, quote DEF, comma ABC, oops, comma DEF, comma GHI. So I'm just going to create a list and I can look at what the list is. It's just a bunch of values. And obviously lists allow us to have duplicates, right? So if I wanted to create a dictionary that would count for me in that perspective, I'm just going to create a dictionary, an empty one called D, just to kind of keep it simple. So now what I can do is I can iterate over the list. Okay. So for each entry in L, right? So for every entry that's in the list that I have, I want to basically add that to the dictionary. But what I want to do first is I want to say, okay, if that's the case, I want to say try, and this is how I do it. There's a couple of the different ways to do it. I'm going to say try value, or we'll say count, make it specific. If count equals D bracket each entry, I can type this morning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to get the current count that is associated with that key, right? So in this case, I'm looking for the key each entry, right? Which in this case, if I look at each entry, I can't look at it here, but it would be ABC. If I have an entry for ABC, then what I'm going to do, oops. Okay. It's being picky because of the indentation. Let me just create a new script here. Just do what I just did. Sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to do that in the Python editor, in the Python shell. You have to kind of create a script to do. It's a bit more complicated. So it also allows me to do some other things here. So in this case, I'm going to check to see if the entry D exists. If it does, I'm going to say D bracket each entry equals. I'm going to add 1 to the count. If it already exists and I have a count, I'm going to bump the count and I'm going to set that equal to count. Okay. If I get an exception, it means that each entry, whatever it is in this particular case, did not yet exist in the dictionary. Therefore, I'm going to say D bracket each entry equals 1. Okay. Then what I can do, since this is simple, I'm just going to print D, which would be the dictionary that I created. So if I did everything right, which I might not have, but we'll call this dictionary test. I can now come right back to my script and I can basically step through this, right? So in this case, I'm going to step into this script. It'll tell me if I created any syntax errors, which I didn't. It's a miracle. Oops, I got to make this L. Yeah, I did make a mistake. So again, I can put my cursor over L. And it's going to show me what's in that list, A, B, C, D, E, F, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, H, I, right? I'm going to create an empty dictionary. And now I'm going to iterate over L. And when I do that, the first thing I'm going to encounter is I'm going to see if each entry, ABC, exists in the dictionary. We know, if I put my cursor over D, it doesn't, right? The entry, the dictionary is empty at this point. So based on that, I'm going to get an exception because I couldn't get the value that I was looking for. So in that case, I'm going to set the dictionary key, each entry equal to 1. If I come back now and look at my D, right, it equals ABC is equal to 1. Okay, that worked good. So now we're going to come down. In this case, the second time through the loop, it's DEF. That also doesn't exist in the dictionary. So now it's going to create a new entry for DEF. If I look at this, now I have 2 entries in my dictionary, ABC set to 1. So the ABC is the key, value is 1. DEF is the key, value is 1. So in this case, I'm going to come back through here, and this time through the loop, because I'm looking at each entry ABC, right, which we have an entry in the dictionary already, ABC, right? So now I'm going to increase the count. So I got the count. How many times did it occur? Once. So now I'm going to increment the count by 1, and I'm going to update that dictionary entry. Dictionaries are mutable. In other words, they can be changed, just like lists can be changed. If I put my cursor over the dictionary now, it says ABC and it has a value of 2, right? So same thing here. The second case was DEF. It already had a value, so I'm going to increase that count by 1, right? And now if I look back at my dictionary, I've got ABC is set to 2, DEF is set to 2, and now I'm going to do the last value, which doesn't exist, which is GHI. And now I've exhausted my list, and now I print out my dictionary, which is ABC is 2, DEF is 2, GHI is 1. That's how many that are there. So the important thing that typically happens when you're doing this kind of thing, that the indentation is not right. And typically, if you're getting 1 every time, it probably indicates that you're not handling this, the case of updating the entry in the dictionary that's associated with your case. In your case, if I've got multiple emails that match, right? In this particular case, I have to check to see if it already exists in the dictionary. And if it does, I've got to increase the value associated with that key. Obviously, you'd be using the email address as the key, and the value would be the count. And then you should be all set. That's sort of kind of walk through, excuse me, sort of walk through kind of the process that you go through.
Yeah, that helped a lot. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, again, it's whenever you're, this is a great example, because whenever you're trying to do that kind of thing, everybody wants to basically put it into their big script that they're writing, right? And I'm not saying that you haven't done this, but basically when you come here, you can write another small script that can actually make sure that you understand how to actually do that. And then once you figure out the process there, then it's easier to integrate that back into your real script using that method. So you can kind of play around here within the integrated development environment to try different things. And then once you kind of master that particular aspect, just for everybody else, you can then go back. And in some case, you can do it right within the Python shell. But in this case, the script was a little bit more complicated, so a little bit harder to do directly within the Python shell. Cool. Anybody else? Any other questions on any topic? If we can pull those off.
I had a follow-up to that one right there.
Yeah,
I
sure.
also got the 1 for the first project, assignment 7, but I think we weren't looking at the entire bin file, right? It was only an excerpt of the bin file. I'm not sure if I said that correctly.
Yeah, no, that's question. So you have to iterate through the bin file. And so keeping track of this for each of the chunks. So kind of back to the example that I did originally in the loops, you're going to have a loop here, and you're going to, for each of the chunks that you read, you're going to have to process do that step that we did here. Where'd it go? Here inside for each chunk. So for each chunk, this is where you're going to put the examination of whether or not, you had any URLs or emails or words that you wanted to add to your dictionaries, right? Because you'd have multiple dictionaries in order to do that. So for each chunk, you need to make sure that you've processed each chunk and then updated it associate. So the trick there is going to be is make sure where you've initialized, go back to the dictionary test, make sure that you're initializing your dictionaries here. So you might have, in this case, an email dictionary, and you might have, a URL dictionary. And these need to be outside of the loops that you're going through while you're processing the chunks of the file. From that perspective, the only other issue with the chunks of the file process here, if I wanted to, let's say I wanted to take this to another level, instead of just printing out the chunk count, let me bring in another bin ASCII import hexlify. We just bring in another function from a standard library called hexlify, and let's say when I read this chunk, right, in this particular example, if I have a chunk, instead of printing out the chunk count, I might want to print out hexlify chunk bracket 0:20. I think I got that right. So now it's going to print out the first 20 bytes of the chunk. So let me see if I did that right. So when I read this chunk in now, if I have a chunk, I'm going to print out the first, in this case, 20 bytes of that particular file, right? And do that each time through the loop. The problem is that what if I have overlapping values that were in between the chunks? In other words, let's say I was looking for an email address, right? And let's say the email address started at the end of the previous chunk and the rest of it's in this chunk. How do I handle, that situation from that perspective? And what you would do is create another variable here. We'll call this save chunk. What I would do, for each of the chunks, if I have those chunks, so I'm going to do this for each of the chunks through the file, right? What I would do here is I would say save chunk equals chunk bracket, I don't know, -20 colon. I'll tell you what that means in a second if I got it right. And then what I would do here is I would say chunk equals save chunk plus chunk. The only thing I have to do is make sure this was binary. Any bytes. So basically what I'm doing is, in this particular case, I'm creating a save chunk, which at the first time through the loop, there is nothing to save because I'm going to read the first chunk. But once I read the first chunk, I can, I'm going to prepend to the chunk variable, whatever I saved from the previous chunk. Obviously, the first time in the loop, there's nothing to add. But the second time through the loop, there is. So let's see if I got this right. Doing this off the top of my head. So again, my save chunk has got nothing in it to start with. I'm going to read my chunk of that particular file, the first 1024 bytes. There it is. And then I'm going to concatenate the saved value, which is nothing, to the chunk. If I have a chunk, I'm going to print out the first 20 bytes. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to save a little piece of that chunk, basically the last 20 bytes of that. So the minus 20 says, hey, start at the end of the chunk and go back 20, and then colon nothing means to the end. So it's a little bit tricky, but now we've got the chunk. But this time through the loop, when I read it, I have values in save chunk, and then I have the chunk. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to prepend that. And now when I do this, I'm seeing what was at the end of the previous chunk, because I only did 20. If I do this, let's do this one more time to make this more realistic. And so you can kind of see how the overlap worked. So again, first time through the chunk, nothing. I saved the first 20. The second time through the chunk, I've prepended what was in the previous chunk with the new chunk, right? And now when I print the hexlify, I see, that that value that was at the beginning and then the next part of the chunk. Okay. So again, just to kind of see how you actually can do that, to pull that, so that if you were then evaluating the content of the chunk, you would pick up, this overlap that might have occurred between the two chunks to basically identify emails or URLs that might have overlapped, the chunk that you're working on right now. So that's the other little trick there. That was kind of extra credit. You didn't have to do that, but basically to show you how to save, that when you want to actually handle things across the chunks. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing in how I did that. Let's do one thing down here in the Python shell to make sure that the slicing makes sense to everybody that haven't seen that before. So if I have a string, we'll just call it S. So let's say I just have a string, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. I can say S bracket 0:10, right? And it's only going to print the first 10 values within the string. I could also say, this is called slicing with a string. I could say 10:20, and it's going to basically show me the values from 10 to 20 within the string. In other words, their position. Remember, they start at 0 and go to the end. I could also say something like S bracket 20:, don't give it a second value, and that'll give me everything after 20. So it's going to give me everything to the end of the string. But if I said S bracket -5:, so it's going to start here, go back 5, and then go to the end and give me the last 5. It's really useful when you're trying to pull, like, say, an extension from a file name, that kind of thing. You could kind of use that trick to do it. There's also functions to give you the extension, but just to show you how you can basically use slicing. And by the way, slicing works for strings and lists, so it doesn't work just for strings. So you can actually slice the values, kind of the technical term that we're doing here, in order to get specific values within a string. And as we've seen before, I can say word list equals S dot split, and basically give me a word list now, and now it'll give me each of the words that were in that string, just to kind of reinforce that concept. So again, just when you're in here in the integrated development environment and you want to try some of these things, come to the Python shell and try them. Create yourself a little example so you can actually see how slicing works, and then you'll see how you can use that in your script. Again, I'm not positive that answered your complete question, but just wanted to kind of walk you through how you actually approach, this processing of chunks, and then making sure that you're handling the overlap and where you would place your code in order to make sure that you were processing data from each of the chunks of the larger file that you were processing. Sort of makes sense?
Yeah, and like you said, that's not even that relevant maybe for this project, but I'm sure, in future weeks it will. So
you got it. Yep. Just kind of a heads up of how we actually do that. Good. Anything else? Anybody else have another question? Again, you can throw them to the chat if you don't want to talk, or otherwise you can unmute your mic and throw them out from that perspective. Elizabeth, I know that you're online and you basically serve as the TA and facilitator for several of my classes. Did anything come across your desk this week that would be worth covering in the tutoring session?
Nothing that I've seen so far, but I feel like I might get more questions this week though. I haven't got any emails though.
Okay, good. Yeah, I got a couple emails as well. And again, we can cover some of these kinds of things during the office hours that I hold on Monday for all the classes. And so if you have specific questions, and again, for the tutoring session and for the office hours, make sure if you can craft a message of areas that you're having trouble, and then I can make sure that I have a prepared solution to those questions. And again, I won't solve the assignment for you, but if you have a Python, if you can craft the question in the form of, hey, how do I do this in Python? Then I can actually cover those with examples that don't detract from the actual assignment you're working on. Any other questions from the group? Was this session, let me ask the general question, you can just throw the answer to the chat. Was this helpful to the general group of going through these kinds of Python examples to help reinforce what you're trying to do? That's the purpose of these tutoring sessions on Saturday. Okay, good. So before I won't, I'll stay around if you guys want to do more, but if you guys are good for the weekend, any final questions? Going once, going twice?
Professor.
Yeah.
As far as you've taken over a class recently, the CYBV 312 SP22 course, how do I reach out, or how do I get in contact with either the TA or yourself regarding that class? There's been so many changes that I feel absolutely lost with what's going on.
Yeah, no problem. Just send me an email. I'm registered in the class now. It's just chesterhosmer@arizona.edu.
Okay.
You could just send me a message there. Also, I have to go look. I normally set up a discussion thread in each of my classes. If it's not there, I will do that. And then you can also post questions to the discussion thread it's just kind of a general discussion, not graded, just to basically throw questions there that they would help you or other students in the class. And for that class, I did schedule an office hour for Monday.
Okay.
It'd be good to come to that. And then the next live lecture will be on Wednesday. Okay. So I've scheduled that as well. So those are 2 additional opportunities, but please don't hesitate to send me emails. I'm making changes to the shell, the D2L, as you probably have seen. Yep. If not, go look at those. I've added a lot of scripts and videos, that kind of stuff to the current week that we're working on. And don't worry, we will get caught up. We have plenty of time to do that. And I've extended deadlines and that kind of stuff to make sure that everybody has enough time to get caught up.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Hey, you're welcome. Okay, cool. So yeah, if that's all there is today, let's shut this down. And Elizabeth, you wanted to talk afterwards, that's fine. If everybody else would be kind enough to log out, and then I can have a private conversation with Elizabeth, and we'll be there. So have a good weekend, everybody. Watch the Super Bowl if you're into that kind of thing, and don't forget Valentine's Day and Monday. Yeah, just a reminder from me. That's
Have a
probably
good
to
weekend, everyone.
myself, you know. All right, have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Allison.
Make sure you give that reminder to my boyfriend too about Monday.
Okay, I'll do that. Yeah. Have a good one.